Hey everyone, I am James, and this is Games According to James. This week, or this episode, I should say, since I don't do this weekly, we're going to talk about RPGs and Wargames. Now, I think some people thought this was going to be really a which one is better, which one is worse, why is one better than the other, why is one worse than the other. But it's not. It's more of a discussion of which itch does each scratch, so to speak. So that's what I want to talk to you today about. Now, this episode may not take that long because I'm pretty even keel on both because I play both. But I'm going to go through each with a few points of my own opinion as to what they offer, and that way you can kind of think in, well, which category do you really fall under? Because while there is a bit of crossover, there's no real 50-50 split in a lot of games. They tend to lean towards one or the other, while some do have crossover. But I'll touch on that a little later. But I tend to play both when I can. Currently, I play Wargames more, just because of the time factor. It's easier to throw down, for example, but again, that's something I'll get into in a little bit. I know some people prefer role-playing games, and they'll pound the desk with their fist till the ends of time. Role-playing games are way better for X, Y, Z. Other people will pound the desk saying miniature games are way better for A, B, C. They're both right. They're both wrong. Neither is better than the other. It's no different than saying video game TV consoles are better than PC, or vice versa. Neither's really better than the other. They're different. They have different things to offer. And in some ways, they're getting closer and closer to being more similar than not. Now, RPGs, role-playing games, obviously most people listening to this should know what an RPG is. They're a little more small scale, shall we say. 4 to 6 people with a person running the game, directing it, if you will. I always looked at RPGs as taking part in a play or a TV show, a movie shoot, something along those lines, that you're playing a part. The GM's your director and producer. So you play your part the best you can to move the story along, hopefully to the desired ending, be it the good guys win, bad guys win, what have you. And in that sense, RPGs offer a number of things. One of which it's very imaginative. Unless you're using a lot of props and maps and such, every player at the table is going to picture the antagonists or the location differently in some way. They're not going to see it exactly the same. Regardless of the description, everyone's going to see it even just slightly different, which is pretty cool, because then you have an idea of what your world looks like, while other players see it their own way, and that way everybody gets a similar enjoyment out of, well, yeah, this, this thing here, yeah. And sometimes you can get a consensus on what something's like, but generally speaking, everyone's going to have slightly varied opinions of what something is like. The other thing with role-playing games, it's very immersive because of it. Your interactions with non-player characters, your interactions with your fellow player characters, and trying to make decisions and figure things out. Granted, dice may allow you to figure things out or not figure things out that you yourself can figure out or not figure out. Just because of the way the game's written, obviously, there's always that chance to fail, chance to succeed. And the other thing with role-playing games too, though, much like TV and movies, you get a very wide variety of character types showing up. It's not a platoon of grunts. It's not a special forces team or everybody is a military guy, or though it can be depending on the game you're playing. But even in that case, they're usually, each one is a specialized type character. One's the driver, one's the demolitions guy, one's the heavy weapons expert, one's the hacker. Everybody's going to be different. It's not six people of the exact same character type. So you get a lot of variety, and you end up encountering a lot of variety while you play, be it at the bar, be it at City Hall, be it out in the field, be it just wandering through a village on your way to where you need to go. And that adds to the concept of you're in a movie or a play or a TV show on your travels and such, which that can be a lot of fun. It's time consuming for the GM because they're the ones who have to come up with a campaign or that night's adventure and write up the encounters and have an idea of the places and things you're going to do. So in that sense, it can be time consuming anyway for the game master. Not so much for the players. They really generally just have to show up and play. But the planning ahead of time for a lot of GMs takes a while, and I think that's why we've seen a slow decline in some ways of role playing. Mainly because people get older, and the biggest demographic that used to play is kind of gotten older, gotten married, had kids, got jobs and families, so it's hard to maintain that weekly game, and that's one thing I've noticed here now, which it is an issue, but not overly if you can work around it. But there have been things to mitigate that to a degree. Things like Pathfinder Society and D&D Adventure League, where you really do just have to show up. Everything's pre-made by Wizards of the Coast or I can't remember the name, Paizo, who makes Pathfinder. It's all pre-generated stuff, so you just need people to run the game. So if you can manage an evening, you get to play every week. There's less prep on the GM side, and it's just a quicker thing. But that said, generally speaking, a lot of people play at home. Most people play at home, and it takes time to figure the stuff out, right? One of the other things about RPGs as well is your combat is usually very detailed. What I mean by that is you can explain, I'm going to do a roundhouse kick over here, or I'm going to do a spinning slash with my sword, or I'm going to do a double tap and try to get both of those guys, and things along those lines where you go a lot more in depth as to what you're doing. And again, these are things that take time away from other elements. They're not just bang, 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 because you got 6 different people who are each taking their turn, each explaining what they want to do, each going through the motions to do that. Now, while that's fun, especially if you're playing a game like Ninjas and Super Spies, where they have all kinds of martial arts and you can do all kinds of martial art moves and different things, it does slow down gameplay. It can't not slow down gameplay, because detail generally does. Generalizations make things quicker. Details slow things down. That's the natural way of things, in my opinion. But the thing with the details is details play into story driving, which is the whole point behind role-playing games. Typically, role-playing games are story driven. They are not generally objective driven. It's more about the path rather than the result. In most cases, the result is you want to get the result you want, but the path to that result is really the point behind it. It's to step out of yourself. It's to do something you're not, be something you're not. And that's where role-playing games really scratch an itch for a lot of people. They want to step out of life. They want to escape life. We all want to escape life at times. It's just the way it is. Life sometimes gets overwhelming, or you just need 4 hours away from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. Regardless of how good or bad your life may be, you need that. You need to step back, and role-playing games really offer that escape aspect to gaming, much like playing a game like I'm trying to think. I don't do much. I'm not much of a video gamer, but there's a lot of video games that are story driven. It's playing that for a couple hours. Why? Because you can just kind of ignore everything else, get into the game, and just play. And that's what RPGs are like. And those are all great things, except they do, for on the part of the GM, they take time. You gotta coordinate a schedule of half a dozen people. That gets tricky. You need a place to play, and if things are going on that you can't play in your regular spot, well, it's a little harder to just, you can't just go to Tim Hortons and start playing Dungeons and Dragons. It doesn't quite work that way. And you can't do that for war games either, mind you. But RPGs scratch that itch, and they are good in that sense. And I can't say they're worse than anything else or better than anything else. They're what they are. They scratch the escapist itch. They scratch the imagination itch. They scratch the storytelling itch. And the fact they do all three is just a bonus. It's and there's so many things you can do. You can do Dungeons and Dragons or Pathfinder to get that I'm a medieval type knight fighting a dragon feel. You can do Star Wars and be Boba Fett or Jango Fett, or even, well, we'll go more current, The Mandalorian. And you can protect Baby Yoda. You can do that in RPGs. Or in between, you can be James Bond, which is fairly quote-unquote modern. And they offer that whole wide range, and it's more specialized missions, things along of that nature. Now there are other games that allow similar concept, but there's less role playing to it, really. And that's kind of where I stand on role playing games. I like them, I play them, at least when I can. Again, time crunch makes it much less often than I'd like, but it is what it is, and I do enjoy them. I've always enjoyed them. I've got shelves full of books for them, and it's not an either or for me. I prefer to play what I prefer to play when I prefer to play it. But that said, it's they are what they are. Now, war games, on the other hand, war games. So, the last several years, I've become much more of a war gamer than a role player. For me, it is a matter of it's easier to find a single opponent and arrange a time to play with that person. So that's the big plus for me with war games, is I can message somebody and say, hey, are you free such and such time? Yep. All right, do you want to play this, this, or this? Okay, great. I'll see you there. Now, that's really the big plus. The other thing is, most war games, they have fairly rigid rules that you follow. The companies are usually pretty good with sending out an FAQ to fix issues as they go, or they'll put out errata. So you have rules to follow. They're hard to misinterpret most of the time, and it just makes game flow much easier. The other thing with war games is, for the most part, they allow for larger scale battles where you're moving units rather than individuals. There are a few games that lend themselves to individuals. A game like Imperial Assault, for example, is you can play individual characters to complete the quote-unquote mission objective, or you can play squads of stormtroopers instead and do similar things. But generally speaking, the scope of battle in a war game by nature is just larger than you would deal with in a role-playing game. It gives you similar units, it gives you specialty units instead of individuals. Is very much a tactically oriented thing, where role-playing games are more of an imaginative thing. You have your table or your map, be it hex or otherwise, or grid. And it really is, as I've told people, a more complicated version of chess because there's way more tactical variables involved than there is in chess with most war games, especially if you're playing on a three-dimensional table where you measure inches rather than grid squares or hexes. And for people who like that style of game, it works out pretty well. There's generally less prep time unless you're playing some kind of quote-unquote campaign mode. Most games don't have that, though they try to do that as part of an organized play program where you have to fight certain types of battles to obtain some objective of some kind. But generally speaking, war games are meant to just throw down and play. I know FFG has brought out a Rebellion on the Rim, or In the Rim, and the Carillion campaign, both of which have campaign aspects to it, but really in the end, they're just skirmish or full-sized regular games for Star Wars Armada. I know a fan-based campaign system, Heroes of the Antari Cluster, was put out for X-Wing. So you start out as this low-level pilot, and you go through the missions, and you improve your pilot skill, upgrade your fighter, change fighters, what have you. But in the end, it's really, you're just playing a furball, which is you flying your fighter and other people flying their fighters. It's a cooperative game, which is generally a regular game, more or less. And that's all well and good, but it doesn't really scratch the role-playing itch, per se. And that's one of those aspects that crosses over a bit. Now, the other thing, too, is with war games, there's a little less randomness to it. Yes, they all use dice. There's always going to be that level of randomness. But if you have a better tactical mind than your opponent, then there's less randomness outside of the dice. You're less likely to make a poor move because, well, you know what you're doing, so to speak. And sometimes you'll make a bad move, you'll make a wrong assumption or something, but generally speaking, if you have a tactical mind versus someone who doesn't, you're going to do things they're not expecting and catch them in a crossfire or flank them or whatever the case may be. The tactical aspect, the better you are at tactics, the lower the randomness becomes. And if you get two really good players, the randomness becomes the dice and the dice alone, not necessarily what you're doing, or the table, or the environment, or the units themselves. It just becomes the dice, nothing more. And watching two really good players can be a lot of fun, because they're going to try to outmaneuver each other, they're going to do different things, and along those lines. And as I said earlier too, it's just easier to just get a game in many cases, because you really only have to coordinate with one other person, not six. And a lot of these war games don't need 3D terrain. They just use hex maps or a grid map or a 3x3 mat of some kind. For example, X-Wing uses a mat. It has dice, but maneuvering is just templates. The game can be played in under an hour, no problem. An older game like Battletech uses hex maps, so you don't need terrain. You don't even need that many miniatures, because a classic game, if you're playing classic, you play a couple mechs aside, that'll probably take you an hour or so, give or take. And then, yeah, there's other games that will take much longer, but if you're planning, it's easier to plan with one person, it's easier to plan a longer period of time to play as well. For instance, Flames of War and Team Yankee will probably take 2 to 3 hours, because generally you're probably going to shoot the shit with the person you're playing with and whatnot too, right? So some games take longer, some games take less, but generally speaking, it's easier to just get a game in, and really that's the biggest bonus for me on that. Now again, there's games that have some crossover. I already mentioned one, Imperial Assault. The Heroes of the Antari Cluster, done by a fan of X-Wing. there's not a lot of crossover in that sense. I know 3.x D&D kind of reintroduced using grid maps for combat when it comes to the role-playing adventures and campaigns. So there's some tactical in there, as well as many of the feats involved that enhance skills and abilities have a tactical feel to them. So there is some crossover there, but that's only part of the game, or much of the game in D&D, and I believe in Pathfinder as well, is imagination driven, not necessarily tactically driven. On the Wargame side, there's campaigns. I know we were trying to do one for Team Yankee where it's the Cold War went hot in the 1980s, so Soviet Union was invading Europe. So you had to stem the tide and fight them back. So there were certain battles at certain cities, and you had a set period of time to get this done. And the more battles you won, the more victory points you got. And at the end of the campaign time frame, whoever had the most victory points won the quote-unquote Third World War. And they had some things for Flames of War, which is just a World War II version of the same game. I know they've tried to do campaign kind of things for Warhammer 40k, but in the end, while they're campaigns, it's still not role-playing. So it really doesn't scratch that itch. And the same thing with using maps and grids for D&D or Pathfinder. There's some tactical thinking involved, but it really doesn't scratch that itch either. There's some aspects included, but it really isn't what it is. Now the other thing with Wargames as well, though, there is less prep time. There really is. If you know how to play a game, it won't take you long to get a force together or grab a couple of units and be ready to throw down. There's no GM having to take time to prep an adventure or a campaign, and again, there's less issues coordinating schedules. But that's the huge plus for me again for wargaming, is just it's easier to just throw down and sling dice and blow shit up and have a good afternoon, and just to kind of shift away from regular life in that sense. But that's kind of where I stand on the two. Both have their pluses, and obviously they're not perfect, and neither will be perfect. And anybody who tells you, oh, role-playing's better than wargaming and wargaming's better than role-playing doesn't know their head from their ass, in my opinion, because both have a place. Just as board games have a place, just as CCGs have a place, just as video games have a place. Hell, I would say LARPing predates pretty much any of this, because kids 100 years ago, as politically incorrect as it was to do 150 years ago, would be playing Cowboys and Indians. When I was a kid, we basically played a variation of Cops and Robbers. We've all been wargaming or role-playing in some way, probably for a portion of our lives when we were kids. We may not do it now, but I almost guarantee the vast majority of us did something like that when we were kids. Just many of us continued on into adulthood. But yeah, that's kind of where it is. So for me, it's just a matter of what itch I want scratched and when. I hadn't played a role-playing game in quite some time, but recently a friend of mine decided to run a D6 Star Wars campaign, and I was like, yep, I'm in. And we've had 2 sessions. It's been good so far. And it's nice to stretch those legs again, because it's been a while. But wargaming I've been doing pretty relatively consistently for the last few years by comparison, and you know, I'll go stretches for weeks or a month or two where I may not play a game, but generally speaking, I'll get games in, and it always feels nice to get to the table and kind of play X-Wing or something. So as I say, stretch my wings and fly, or stretch my legs and get the troops on the table. In that sense, role-playing, stretch your mind, You know, it's all good. It's all meant to be fun. So why many people like to compare and try to one up, saying, well, this is better because of that, or that's better because of this. I don't understand it. Like, I used to play video games. I don't anymore. I'm more of a Atari, NES, Sega Genesis guy. Modern games, by and large, don't appeal to me for whatever reason. Board games, I'm a classic board game guy, so Monopoly, things like that. Game of Life, even. But, they all have a place, and honestly, I think all of us should really look at sampling everything. A lot of stores well, I know locally they used to. I think they're looking to start it up again. Do a board game night. Go try out board games. It's a different thing. It exercises a different part of the mind. It, as I've been saying this entire episode, scratches a different itch. But the same thing with video games. It's just not something that appeals to me. But I used to play video games, so they're all there. The aspects are all there. The elements are all there to different degrees in every single one of those styles of game. Same thing with CCGs. I played Magic because my friends did. I really didn't do much for that. And again, it's just not something that appeals to me on a large scale. If somebody has a deck and wants to play and walk me through it, I'll play. It's not a big deal. And it's just, I never understood, like, this is where I'm getting on my soapbox now. I never understood why people felt the need to thump their chest, say mine's better. And I think that's where we run into a lot of issues at local stores, at local conventions. It's just, he's just a wargamer. Oh, they're just a role player. They're nothing or whatever. I never understood that. We're all gamers. Again, be it CCG, video, board, role playing, wargaming, we're all gamers. And it's in my opinion that we should take part in more than one style of game if we can. If we can't, then obviously you pick the one that appeals to you the most, but get out there and sample other stuff. You might surprise yourself as to how much you like it, or you might realize, hey, maybe this fits me better for whatever reason, but because you've never tried it, you don't know. So I'm going to wrap up there. I hope you have a better idea of where I stand on it, and maybe giving you some nuggets to chew on, and maybe try one over the other if you don't really do one over the other. And like I said, we're all gamers. We should all be looking out for each other, for starters, because Lord knows we still get kind of looked down upon. But try it all. It's all fun. It all has their own thing. They all satisfy certain needs and wants to different degrees. So I'm James. This has been Games According to James, and I will talk to you next time.